The sun bled across the horizon like a wound refusing to close, staining the vast West Texas sky in ribbons of crimson and violet. Dust spiraled in restless swirls over the parched earth, drifting past splintered fences and brittle grass that crumbled at the lightest touch. It was a land starved of rain, a place where silence carried heavier than sound, and where the faintest shift of wind felt like the whisper of fate. On the edge of this silence stood a lone cabin, its boards weathered, its windows shadowed, and upon its porch a figure lingered. Margaret Sullivan, her black dress fading under the weight of both sun and grief, her hands clasped around the wooden rail as though holding herself to the world by sheer will. Her eyes, grey as storm clouds that never came, traced the horizon not for beauty, but for survival. The ranch that had been her husband's dream and her inheritance was slowly being devoured by drought and debt. She had buried Thomas beneath the cottonwoods 8 months ago, and the soil had not settled over his grave before the land began to turn against her. Yet she stood there still, strong and slender, the sort of beauty carved by endurance, the sort of strength that came not from choice but from necessity. Behind her, the quiet voice of her son broke through the rustle of the dying prairie. "Mama, the chickens sound worried again." Samuel, with his sandy hair and eyes too solemn for his 4 years, clutched a wooden horse, its paint chipped, its wheel broken, a silent relic of the father he would never see again. Margaret bent and touched his cheek, her palm cool despite the heat. "They're only thirsty, sweet boy," she murmured, though her gaze drifted toward the well with a tightening of her chest. Every trip to draw water felt like pulling hope from the deep, and every bucket came up lighter. Still she walked across the dry yard, boots crunching against the brittle earth, the weight of the sky pressing down upon her shoulders. Her fingers curled around the rope, lowering the bucket into the well. Seconds passed, too many, before the faint splash reached her ears. She hauled the bucket back up, half full, the water murky. It was a reflection of her life, clouded, insufficient, yet clung to because it was all that remained. As she carried it back, the silence fractured. A horse's distant rhythm carried through the dusk. Her body froze, her heart tightening as though some long-forgotten instinct had awakened. Strangers in this country were rarely messengers of kindness. She set the bucket down and reached for the rifle, leaning against the porch. Samuel, sensing her unease, pressed himself against her skirt, clutching tighter to his wooden toy. The figure on horseback grew out of the horizon, first a shadow, then a man bent against the weight of his ride. His horse stumbled slightly, lathered with exhaustion, and yet the rider held himself tall. As he drew nearer, the sinking sun painted him in molten light. A man clad in worn leather, chaps dulled by dust, a shirt faded but neat, his hat pulled low. When he reined in before her gate, he lifted his head, and Margaret's breath caught. His eyes were pale blue, almost grey, carrying not just weariness, but years of unspoken storms. "Evening, ma'am," his voice rasped, hoarse from dust and silence. "Name's Jake Ryland. My horse threw a shoe back yonder. I hoped you might allow me to use your tools to set it right. I can work, if payment's needed." Margaret's grip on the rifle loosened, though not completely. She studied him, his belt worn but well kept, his hands scarred but steady, his posture respectful rather than imposing. For a long moment, silence hung between them, like a thread pulled taut. At last she inclined her head. "The forge is in the barn." "Supper at sunset, nothing more." Jake nodded, gratitude flickering in his eyes. As he led his horse toward the barn, Margaret's gaze followed him, unwilling yet unable to look away. Something in the stillness of the evening shifted, like the faint scent of rain when the earth had long forgotten water. She told herself it was charity, a simple act of kindness, but as she stirred beans over the fire and added more cornbread than she'd planned, her chest tightened with something far more dangerous: hope. The meal was quiet, broken only by Samuel's shy questions and Jake's soft, patient replies. When night pressed against the cabin walls, Margaret offered him the barn for rest. She lay awake long after Samuel had drifted into dreams, listening to the faint sounds of movement outside, the brush of hooves, the soft murmur of a man speaking low to his horse as if it were kin. She turned her face toward the ceiling beams, her heart a storm of grief, weariness, and an ember of something she dared not name. Dawn painted the plains in cold silver light. From her window, Margaret saw him already at work. He had risen before her, mending the fence, checking the coop, shoulders bent with tireless purpose. When he lifted his face to the morning sun, Margaret's breath stumbled. The world had taken much from him too, she realized. She could see it in the hollows beneath his eyes, in the quiet way he moved, as if carrying ghosts no one else could see. For days that became weeks, his presence wove itself into the rhythm of her ranch. He worked with steady hands, mended what she had resigned to loss, and each evening he ate humbly at her table, retreating to the barn with no demand for more. Samuel followed him like a shadow, and Jake bore the child's endless questions with gentle patience that drew laughter. Margaret thought she had buried forever. The town, of course, whispered. They always did. Widow Sullivan harboring a drifter. A woman too proud to remarry, now taking in a stranger beneath her roof. The disapproval pricked at her, but when she looked at the boy's smile as Jake showed him how to oil a saddle, or at the strength in Jake's hands repairing the roof beam, she let the gossip drift like dust on the wind. But peace in the frontier was fragile. The land, parched and unforgiving, demanded more each day. The wells sank lower. Cattle ribs pressed against their hides. Margaret's nights filled with fear of losing all she fought to keep. And beyond the fence line, trouble stirred. The bank circled like vultures, and men with hungers sharper than droughted earth watched from shadows. Still, in the quiet between labors, in the warmth of firelight, there grew a closeness that no drought could wither. It was in the way Jake's eyes softened when Samuel clambered onto his lap, in the way Margaret's voice gentled when she called his name, in the silence that settled between them not as emptiness but as comfort. The air itself seemed to hum with what was unspoken. And so the story of a widow and a drifter began, under skies that withheld rain, on land that tested every ounce of their strength. Their meeting was no accident, but the beginning of something both perilous and healing. A tale of survival would soon become a tale of love, as unrelenting as the desert sun, as tender as the first drops of long-awaited rain. If this story touches something within you, if you feel the weight of the silence, the strength of hope in the darkest drought, let your heart whisper back. Share your thoughts in a comment so that the echoes of these words may find a home beyond the page. Leave a trace of your spirit by subscribing, so you may walk with us through every chapter of love, loss, and healing that follows. And if you find a spark of comfort here, know that your presence is more precious than any treasure. The night deepened again, and the stars stretched endless above them. Margaret stood by the doorway, watching the man who had become part of her home so swiftly, so unexpectedly. Tomorrow the land would test them once more, through fire, through drought, through enemies waiting just beyond the horizon. But for tonight there was warmth, there was breath, there was a fragile but undeniable promise that something greater was beginning. And with the first whisper of wind carrying dust across the plains, the story moved forward into trials that would forge not just survival, but love, strong enough to outlast the desert itself. The days unfolded like pages marked by dust, sweat, and quiet glances that lingered longer than they should have. The land was cruel, demanding, but in its harshness it carved out a rhythm where two weary souls began to find their own measure of peace. Morning after morning, the sound of hammering on the roof, the scrape of tools against wood, and the low murmur of Jake's voice working alongside the silence became as steady as a heartbeat in Margaret's world. She would rise before dawn to light the stove, the cold of night still clinging to the cabin walls. From her window, she'd catch sight of him already moving in the pale grey light, his silhouette strong against the horizon as he carried lumber or checked the corral fence. The sight stirred something she had not allowed herself to feel in months, a quiet warmth, not yet love, but a healing presence, like the slow return of strength after a long illness. Her grief had dulled her senses, left her numb to beauty. But now, in the sound of his steady footsteps and the patience of his work, life began to hum again. Samuel adored him without reservation. The boy, so often solemn since his father's death, laughed again. He trailed behind Jake with a carved stick for a toy rifle, mimicking his movements, asking questions about cattle, horses, and faraway places. Jake answered each with a gentleness that made Margaret's heart ache, his voice warm even when shadows passed briefly over his eyes. He never gave the child empty stories. He spoke plain, honest, but with care. And Samuel, starved for a father's presence, soaked in every word like dry earth drinking rain. At supper, the three of them shared a table that had once felt far too large for two. The clatter of spoons, the crackle of firewood, the small sound of Samuel's laughter. These became the soundtrack of evenings that Margaret dreaded to end. Yet when Jake excused himself to return to the barn, she felt the absence stretch across the cabin like an echo, leaving her both relieved and hollow. In those quiet nights, she lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams, telling herself it was enough to have a strong hand mending the ranch, enough to hear her son laugh again. And yet she could not banish the way her heart quickened when she caught Jake watching her in silence, his eyes carrying questions he never spoke aloud. The town, however, did not share in her healing. Whispers grew sharper, riding into her Sundays at church and her errands at the store. A widow was expected to be somber, respectable, untouched by scandal. A widow was meant to remarry quickly or retreat into solitude, not to carry on with a stranger whose past rode with him like a shadow. Margaret bore the stairs with her chin lifted high, but each word, each look, was a thorn pressing deeper into her skin. Still, she refused to bow. The land was her son's inheritance, her duty, and no tongue wagging in town would drive her from it. Trouble, however, rode closer than whispers. It came one morning with 3 men on horseback, Hutchkins from the saloon, Meyer from the general store, and Pastor Williams. They dismounted with the stiff righteousness of men convinced of their own authority. Margaret stepped onto the porch, Samuel clutching her skirts, her gaze cool as she faced them. Their words were honeyed with concern, but sharp with judgment. They questioned her choice, her reputation, the presence of a strange man under her roof. Before she could answer, Jake rounded the corner of the house, hammer still in hand, his expression calm but watchful. The air shifted. The men faltered beneath the weight of his quiet presence, as if the dust itself waited for his reply. He spoke little, only that he had work to do, and unless they planned to help, they'd best let him continue. His tone was even, polite, but threaded with something dangerous enough to make the men retreat. Margaret's hands shook after they left, yet her heart beat with something fierce. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt defended, not by pity or obligation, but by choice. That night, as firelight flickered on the walls, Jake told her a fragment of his past, a ranch once in Kansas, a wife named Emily, taken by fever, the emptiness that followed. His words were plain, without embellishment, but they carried a weight that spoke of wounds deeper than he allowed himself to reveal. Margaret listened in silence, her hands curled in her lap, her heart aching with an empathy she dared not voice. When he looked at her and said softly, "You're stronger than you know, Margaret Sullivan," her name lingered on his lips like a promise. It was the first time in months she went to bed without the image of her husband's broken body haunting her dreams. Instead, she dreamed of pale blue eyes and the sound of steady hammering, like the rhythm of life returning. But the prairie has its own way of testing every fragile beginning. The drought deepened, stripping grass into dust, weakening the cattle until their bones showed through hide. The well sank lower, and each bucket brought up less water than the last. Survival meant movement, and Jake knew it. One evening, watching the herd stand listless under a bruised sky, he told her of Clear Creek, 20 miles across harsh country. It would take 2 days to drive the cattle there, and the risk was great. Yet without water, the herd would perish. Margaret's instinct was fierce. "They're my cattle, my responsibility. If they go, I go." Her voice carried no hesitation. Jake studied her, his eyes unreadable, then nodded. Preparations began. That night, as Samuel clung to her waist and asked if she would return, Margaret bent low, kissed his hair, and whispered, "Always, sweet boy. I will always come back." They set out before dawn, the cattle trudging reluctantly, hooves dragging through dust that rose in choking clouds. Margaret rode her mare, shoulders squared, while Jake guided her late husband's gelding with a grace that made the weary herd move forward. Heat pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck. By nightfall, they camped in a canyon, the stars spilling endless across the black sky. By the fire, they spoke little, but every silence was thick with unspoken truths. Jake's gaze lingered on her longer than before, and Margaret, staring into the flames, admitted quietly, "Thomas never liked that I could ride and rope as well as any man." Jake's reply was blunt, soft but steady. "Then he was a fool. What you've done to keep this ranch alive is worth more than needlepoint in a parlor." She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not just a drifter, but a man who carried the same scars she bore, different yet alike. A man who had lost, yet still fought. Something electric passed between them, fragile but undeniable. She turned away quickly, yet her pulse thrummed with the echo of his words long after the fire dimmed. The prairie, however, offers little time for tenderness. Riders appeared the next night. Men led by Bill Carver, his grin sharp, his words fouled with mockery as his eyes raked over Margaret. He taunted, prodded, dared. And in one motion, quicker than breath, Jake's gun cleared its holster, a bullet punching clean through Carver's hat. "Next one goes lower," he said evenly, voice like steel wrapped in calm. Violence trembled in the air, but Carver withdrew, leaving behind threats as bitter as dust. Margaret's hands shook when it was over, but when Jake touched her shoulder gently and asked, "You all right?" she managed to nod. The look in his eyes, steady and fierce, told her more than words ever could. She was not alone anymore. At dawn, they reached Clear Creek. The cattle surged forward, desperate, plunging into the shallow stream. Relief swept through Margaret, her laughter breaking free like a song she had forgotten she knew. "We made it," she whispered. Jake smiled, rare and true, though his eyes scanned the horizon for danger. That night, as firelight painted their faces, his voice broke through the silence. "When Emily died, I thought I'd never find anything worth standing for again. But then I rode up to your ranch. Maybe running isn't the answer. Maybe fighting alongside someone like you is." Margaret's heart ached, both with sorrow and with the fragile hope his words awoke. She reached across the fire and touched his hand, their fingers intertwining with a quiet certainty that needed no explanation. In that moment, under the vast silence of the sky, the drought, the threats, the gossip, all of it faded. What remained was the pulse of two souls who had been broken, now daring to heal in each other's presence. Beyond the circle of firelight, the prairie lay waiting, holding dangers yet to come. But Margaret felt the rhythm of his hand against hers, steady as a promise, and for the first time in too long she believed that the future, however hard, might carry not only survival, but something deeper, something worth every struggle. And as the stars wheeled overhead, brighter than any lantern flame, the story pressed forward into the tests that would demand more than courage, tests that would carve love out of the very bones of loss, teaching them both that even in the harshest desert a fragile flower could bloom. The cattle drank greedily at Clear Creek, their ribs no longer sharp with desperation, but softening under the cool relief of water. Margaret stood on the bank, her boots sinking into damp earth, the scent of wet grass rising like a forgotten prayer. The sight of her herd alive and drinking filled her chest with a fragile gratitude that trembled just beneath her ribs. She let the moment soak into her like healing balm, even as the echo of Carver's threats lingered on the edges of her thoughts. The man's sneer, the way his eyes had crawled over her like a thief's hands, it was enough to make the air heavy with unease. But when she turned her gaze, she found Jake watching her across the water. He had removed his hat, letting the evening light touch the dark sweep of his hair. His eyes, pale as the winter sky, softened when they met hers. No words passed between them, but something did, a silent assurance, a tether. She exhaled slowly, letting her fear dissolve in the strength of that gaze. They camped on high ground that night, a small fire flickering against the vast canopy of stars. Samuel was far away in Mrs. Johansson's care, and his absence ached like a missing limb. Yet without him, the air between Margaret and Jake thickened with a different kind of weight. She brewed bitter coffee over the flames, her hands trembling only slightly as she handed him a tin cup. Their fingers brushed, a touch quick as a breath, but alive with sparks. Jake sat with his shoulders bowed, the firelight sharpening the lines of his face, revealing both strength and sorrow. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice low, carrying a rough edge. "Emily, my wife. She wasn't afraid of the world. She could outride most men, held her head high even when folks whispered. When she died, I thought maybe the Almighty had punished me for daring to love someone so fiercely. I sold the ranch, drifted like a man without a compass. But now—" His words faltered, and he stared into the flames. "Now I wonder if I wasn't meant to keep running, but to find something, or someone, worth fighting for again." Margaret's heart trembled at his confession. She could feel the ache in him, an old wound that still bled. And in that ache, she saw her own reflection. She reached across the narrow space and laid her hand over his. His palm turned upward, fingers closing around hers as though he'd been waiting all along. She did not speak, for words would only cheapen what had settled between them. Instead, she let the silence carry them, a silence filled not with emptiness, but with the quiet pulse of healing. The prairie gave them little mercy. Near midnight, the darkness fractured with gunfire, shouts, curses, the stampede of frightened hooves tore through the night. Carver had returned, his men's bullets slicing the air. Jake moved like lightning, pulling Margaret down behind a rock, his gun already firing back with sharp precision. Margaret's breath came ragged, but her hands remembered the rifle her father had taught her to use. She aimed, squeezed, and the recoil jolted through her, steadying her spirit. Together they fought, their bodies pressed close, every heartbeat a reminder that they were alive, together, resisting. When at last the attackers retreated, leaving only dust and silence, Jake dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as they skimmed her shoulders, her arms. "You hurt?" His voice was raw, more fear than question. "No," she whispered, breathless. "Are you?" "I'm good." Relief broke through his eyes, and before she could think, she was in his arms. He held her tightly, fiercely, as though letting go would mean losing more than just this battle. She clung to him, her cheek pressed to the warmth of his chest, listening to his heartbeat thunder against her ear. Moonlight traced his features when he pulled back, and for one suspended moment they hovered on the edge of something dangerous, something necessary. His hand brushed a strand of hair from her face, lingering against her cheek. She wanted to kiss him then, to surrender to the longing that had been building like storm clouds since the first night he stepped onto her land. But the cattle needed tending, and the danger had not passed. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, and only nodded, steady, respectful. That unspoken restraint drew her closer to him than any touch could. At dawn, as they gathered the scattered cattle, Margaret's body ached with exhaustion, but her spirit burned with something new. No longer was she merely surviving. She was fighting alongside someone who made her stronger, someone who carried her burdens without taking her pride. Together, they drove the herd home, their shoulders brushing, their silence comfortable. By the time they returned to the ranch, word had already spread. The town buzzed with whispers sharper than barbed wire. A widow and a drifter, gone together for days, returning with cattle and the scent of danger clinging to them. When Jake suggested he take Samuel into town for supplies, Margaret shook her head firmly. "I won't hide, not in my own home. I won't bow to shame." That night, after Samuel was asleep, Margaret found him on the porch, keeping watch beneath the moon's silver gaze. She brought him coffee, their fingers brushing again as she handed him the cup. Her voice broke the silence, softer than the wind. "I'm tired of pretending, Jake. Tired of acting as if you are only hired help." His breath caught, his eyes burning pale fire. "You know what they'll say." "They're already saying it." Her words carried defiance, but her voice trembled with longing. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat of his body. "I've been good, Jake. I've been proper. But I am tired of being alone." He set the cup aside, his hands rising to cradle her face with tenderness that nearly undid her. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back." Instead of answering, Margaret rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss began hesitant, then deepened, hunger and healing tangled together. His arms pulled her against him, her fingers clutched his shirt, and the world dissolved into warmth and breath and promise. When they parted, both trembling, Jake pressed his forehead to hers. "Woman, you'll be the death of me." "I hope not," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've buried one man already." From that night forward, the current between them was undeniable. Their bond grew not only in stolen kisses, but in the rhythm of shared labor, in the way Jake guided Samuel's small hands over tools, in the way Margaret's laughter returned like spring rain. Even in hardship there was light now, a flame kindled in the ashes of loss. Yet shadows still pressed in. The bank's threats sharpened. Dalton's interest in her land grew bolder, and Carver's presence lingered like a wolf circling just beyond sight. Margaret knew storms lay ahead. But as she stood one evening with Jake's arm steady around her shoulders, Samuel's small hand tucked into hers, and the sun setting in brilliant fire across the plains, she felt strength flow back into her veins. Whatever trials awaited, she was no longer standing alone. She had found not just survival, but the healing warmth of love beginning to bloom in soil thought barren. And as dusk fell, the story turned toward battles of law, fire, and betrayal that would test every fragile promise they had made, forging them together in ways neither could have foreseen. The prairie had a way of testing vows before they were spoken aloud. No sooner had Margaret surrendered to the quiet certainty of Jake's presence than the world reminded her of its cruelty. The drought had deepened, wringing the land of every last drop until the earth cracked and the cattle stood hollow-eyed in the shade, their hides stretched thin across bone. Each morning, Margaret walked the fence line, her skirts brushing against brittle grass that disintegrated beneath her steps. Each evening, she counted the herd and felt her heart sink lower. 3 more had died in as many days. Jake moved through it all with the patience of a man who had weathered storms far worse, but Margaret could see the weight pressing on him, heavy as the Texas sun. He labored without complaint, patching what could be patched, repairing what had been broken, always with Samuel close at his side. The boy had begun to smile again, his laughter rising clear as bird-song when Jake swung him up onto a horse or carved a small toy from leftover wood. Margaret would stand in the doorway, hands clasped against her chest, letting the sound wash through her like medicine for wounds too deep to name. Yet peace could not last. One afternoon, riders came thundering across the horizon, a dust cloud heralding trouble long before their faces came into view. At their head was George Dalton, owner of the sprawling Double D Ranch, his silver-threaded hair gleaming beneath his wide-brimmed hat. At his side rode Elijah Morse, the bank's vulture-eyed representative, and half a dozen hired men who wore their pistols low and easy. Dalton reined in at the Sullivan Gate, his smile smooth, practiced, carrying the confidence of a man who believed the world already belonged to him. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, tipping his hat, "word is the storm took part of your herd. Hard loss. I thought I might offer you some relief." Margaret stood tall on the porch, Samuel clinging to her skirts. Jake stepped forward, his stance casual yet protective, his eyes narrowing slightly beneath the brim of his hat. Dalton's gaze dismissed Jake as though he were little more than a shadow. "You're a strong woman, ma'am, but this land is too much for one. I'll offer you a fair price, enough to clear your debts and give you comfort in town." It's a dignified way to start over. Margaret's jaw tightened. This land is not for sale. Morse's thin smile sharpened. "Your next payment is due in 3 weeks. With your losses, it will be impossible. Foreclosure is inevitable. Mr. Dalton offers generosity where the bank will show only the letter of the law." Jake's voice cut in, quiet, but edged with steel. "She gave you her answer. Best you take it." Dalton's gaze flicked toward him, amused. "I don't deal with drifters." Then, turning back to Margaret, his mask slipped, revealing the hunger beneath. "You've got 3 weeks, ma'am. Think carefully. Pride won't feed your boy." The riders turned and thundered away, leaving only dust and silence in their wake. Samuel buried his face in Margaret's skirts, sensing the danger in the air. Margaret's hand went to Jake's arm, steadying herself against the storm gathering on the horizon. That night, as wind howled against the cabin walls, Jake spoke softly. "They'll push harder. Dalton doesn't like being denied." Margaret stared into the fire, her face illuminated by the flames. "Let him push. This land is my son's inheritance. I will not yield it." Her voice trembled, but her resolve stood firm. The following days blurred with labor and loss. Jake rose before dawn, shoulders bent beneath endless tasks, his hands cracked and raw, yet his eyes steady. Margaret matched him hour for hour, her strength surprising even herself. Together they found a rhythm, her hammer meeting his nail, her voice soothing Samuel while his steady hands rebuilt fences and patched roofs. Their bond deepened in the silence between words, in the shared weight of exhaustion, in the stolen glances that carried more than either dared to say aloud. But trouble was never far. One evening, a glow lit the horizon, red and violent. The barn was aflame before they could reach it, flames devouring the wood with a roar that drowned out every prayer. Horses screamed inside, trapped. Margaret thrust Samuel into Jake's arms and ran toward the inferno. The heat slammed against her, smoke clawing at her throat, but she pressed forward, tearing at latches, driving panicked animals into the night. A burning beam crashed beside her, showering her with sparks. She stumbled, vision blurring, until strong arms wrapped around her and dragged her clear. "Damn fool woman!" Jake's voice was ragged with fear, his chest heaving as he held her against him. "You could have died." Coughing, she pressed her forehead to his shoulder. "The horses. I couldn't let them burn." "To hell with the horses," he muttered, his hands trembling as they skimmed over her, searching for injury. Yet his embrace held something more than anger. It held terror, the kind that only comes when someone's heart nearly shatters. By dawn, the barn was nothing but blackened skeleton timbers, smoke still curling toward the sky. Half the herd was gone, scattered or dead. Margaret stood among the ruins, ash streaking her cheeks, despair heavy in her chest. "It's over," she whispered. "Dalton was right. I've nothing left to fight with." Jake turned her face toward him, his eyes fierce, burning with a light that refused to yield. "Don't you dare give up. You faced Carver's gun. You pulled horses from fire. You're the strongest woman I've ever known, and you're not alone." His hand cupped her cheek, and in Samuel's small voice, steady and solemn, came the words that sealed it. "Don't go away again, Jake. We need you." Jake's gaze never left Margaret's as he answered, his voice steady, a vow written in air. "I'm not going anywhere, son. Your mama's stuck with me now." Despite the ash, despite the ruin, Margaret felt something stir again in her chest, a spark that refused to die. She leaned into Jake's touch, drawing from his strength, her own resolve knitting itself back together. "Then we fight," she said softly. "We fight," he echoed, and bent to kiss her there among the ruins, the rising sun casting light on two souls bound together by fire, loss, and an unshakable promise. The days that followed were nothing short of brutal. With winter closing in, they worked from dawn until their hands bled, salvaging what little the storm had spared. Neighbors came quietly, those who remembered the kindness Margaret had shown in better years, Henrik Johansson bringing tools and muscle, Mary Patterson bringing food. They gave not out of charity, but of loyalty, of respect. And through their help, Margaret and Jake saw the faint outline of possibility. Survival, if only just. But Dalton was not finished. Nor was Carver, whose presence lingered like a shadow at the edge of every night. And as the first snow fell across the blackened remains of the barn, Margaret knew their trials had only begun. The fight would move beyond fire and drought, into courts and threats, into battles of words as dangerous as bullets. Yet, as she watched Jake and Samuel build a snowman in the yard, laughter carrying on the cold air, she felt a warmth bloom inside her. For the first time, she dared to imagine not just survival, but a future. A home not merely endured, but lived in, loved in. A family carved out of hardship, stitched together with resilience and hope. And though the storm ahead promised to test them harder than ever before, Margaret knew she would not face it alone. The horizon darkened, a storm brewing not from weather, but from men. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge awaited, a place where Dalton's wealth and influence threatened to strip her of everything. Yet as she prepared to ride into that den of power, Jake's steady presence at her side, she knew one truth as certain as the rising sun. Whatever the world tried to take from her, love had already given her something greater, something untouchable. And with that certainty, the story pressed forward into the fire of judgment, where land, legacy, and love itself would be put on trial. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge loomed against the winter sky, its red brick facade stern, as if the building itself were carved from judgment. The wind cut sharp that morning, biting at Margaret's cheeks as she climbed the steps with her son's small hand in hers, and Jake steady at her side. Inside her coat, close to her heart, she carried the pouch of coins and bills neighbors had scraped together, the last hope of keeping the ranch alive. Samuel walked solemnly, his Sunday boots clicking against the frozen boards, clutching Jake's hand as though it were already his father's. The room inside was crowded, humming with voices that stilled the moment she entered. Some faces softened with quiet sympathy, others sharpened with scorn, feeding on gossip that had grown like weeds in her absence. George Dalton sat in the front row, flanked by his lawyers in city suits, his broad chest filling with confidence. Elijah Morse hovered near, thin lips pressed into a smile colder than the wind outside. At the judge's bench, Carlton adjusted his spectacles, his jowls sagging as if weighed down by years of listening to men like Dalton, more than women like her. "Mrs. Sullivan," Morse said smoothly, stepping forward. "On time. That's good. I trust you brought your payment." "Every penny," Margaret answered, her voice steady despite the way her heart throbbed in her chest. She reached into her coat, fingers brushing the pouch. "Not so fast," Dalton's lawyer interrupted, rising to his feet. "Before the matter of payment is settled, there is a question of ownership." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Dalton stood, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Your Honor, I have here documentation proving that the Sullivan Ranch has been claiming land not lawfully theirs. The Federal Survey of 1876 shows that Clear Creek lies beyond their true boundary. Those water rights belong to me." Margaret's blood ran cold. She stepped forward, fury lacing her words. "That's a lie. Clear Creek has always been our boundary. My husband bought this land fair and true." Crawford, Dalton's lawyer, held up a map stamped with official-looking seals. "The evidence says otherwise. Without the creek, her land is worthless for ranching. It is only right that justice be served." Gasps stirred the room. Margaret felt her knees weaken, but Jake's hand pressed steady at the small of her back. His voice, calm yet edged like a blade, rang clear. "This is fraud. That map has been doctored. Dalton's men dug up the markers last fall. Can you prove it?" Crawford sneered. Before Margaret could speak, a weathered figure rose from the benches. Henrik Johansson, hat in hand, walked forward with the solemn dignity of a man who owed no one anything. "I can," he said simply. "I helped Thomas Sullivan survey that land. The markers were there. Stone cairns set by army men. I kept records, dates, names, every detail. Those stones stood for years until suddenly they were gone. You don't erase rocks without intent." Dalton's face twitched, but he said nothing. Crawford scoffed. "Hearsay. The law requires more than the word of an old man." Another voice broke the silence, surprising all. Pastor Williams, his thin frame trembling, stood from the back. "I heard Bill Carver and one of Dalton's men boasting in the saloon about digging up stones by the creek. At the time, I said nothing, ashamed of my own cowardice. But I won't bear false witness by silence any longer." The room erupted in whispers. Dalton's jaw clenched, and Carver, seated near the door, surged to his feet, hand twitching toward his gun. Jake stepped instantly in front of Margaret, his hand poised at his own holster. The tension snapped sharp until the sheriff's barked command froze the air. Carver was hauled forward, snarling, while the judge's gavel thundered against wood. When order returned, Judge Carlton's face had paled. "These are serious accusations. Until the matter of the boundary can be investigated, the claim is dismissed. The Sullivan Ranch remains in her possession, pending proof. Margaret exhaled sharply, knees nearly buckling. She stepped forward and set the pouch of coins firmly on the table. "Here is my payment, Your Honor. Every cent owed." The judge nodded. "Then the debt stands satisfied." Dalton's face darkened with fury, his mouth opening as though to protest, but the sound of murmurs around the room drowned him out. For once, the tide of gossip turned, voices whispering not about a widow's scandal, but about Dalton's deceit. When the gavel fell with finality, Margaret sagged against Jake's side. Samuel tugged her coat, his small voice breaking through the hum of relief. "Mamma, does this mean we get to keep our home?" She lifted him into her arms, tears burning her eyes. "Yes, sweet boy, we keep our home." Outside, the winter sun cut cold across the street, but Margaret felt warmth bloom within her chest. People she once thought lost to indifference came forward, shaking her hand, nodding in respect. The Johanssons, Mary Patterson, even the pastor who had condemned her weeks before. Whispers still clung, but something had shifted. Sympathy had replaced suspicion. Jake drew her close as they reached their wagon. "You did it," he murmured, his breath warm against her temple. "No," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it." As they rode home through the frozen fields, the land stretched wide before them, scarred yet beautiful, theirs still. Margaret leaned into Jake's side, Samuel drowsing against her lap, and felt strength thread through her veins once more. Dalton would not yield easily. Carver's hatred would not die quietly, but they had faced down power and survived. That night, as the fire crackled and Samuel slept deeply, Margaret stood on the porch, gazing across the land bathed in silver moonlight. Jake joined her, silent at first, then speaking low. "Dalton will try again. I know. We'll be ready." She turned to him, her eyes glistening, her voice tender. "I'm not afraid any more, Jake. Not with you here." His hand found hers, rough fingers intertwining with her smaller ones, and in that simple connection was a vow stronger than any spoken in court. She leaned against him, her heart steady, her spirit healing. The night air was sharp, but she breathed it in deeply, her lungs filling not with fear but with hope. And though shadows still waited beyond the horizon, Margaret knew the next battle would be met not in loneliness, but with the unbreakable bond of two souls who had chosen to stand together. The dawn that followed painted the land in rose and gold, and with it came the whisper of spring, a promise of renewal, fragile yet alive, carrying them forward into a future where love and resilience would be tested again beneath the endless western sky. Winter pressed itself upon the land like an unwelcome guest, wrapping the ranch in a shroud of white silence. The first snow came early, soft flakes that at first seemed beautiful, drifting over the blackened skeleton of the barn, over the patched fences, over the weary herd huddling against the wind. But as the weeks passed, beauty gave way to hardship. The cold was merciless, sharpening every chore into a trial. Wood split under Jake's axe from dawn until dusk, his breath clouding the air as he stacked each log with careful precision. Margaret preserved what little food they had, stretching thin soups and grinding flour down to its last grain, her hands reddened from washing in icy water. And yet, within that crucible of hardship, Warmth was born. Samuel's laughter returned in bursts, bright as sunlight breaking through grey skies, whenever Jake lifted him high into the air or taught him how to shape snow into the likeness of a horse. Margaret watched them from the porch, her heart swelling with a quiet joy she had thought buried forever. Healing crept into her days, soft as snowflakes, steady as the heartbeat she heard each night when Jake's presence filled the silence. But even as the ranch pulsed with a fragile renewal, danger circled. Dalton's offer had been refused, his humiliation sealed in the courthouse, and men like Dalton did not forget. Carver, too, restless and bitter, had vanished from town after the trial, his name whispered in saloons like a storm cloud hanging just beyond the ridge. Margaret felt their absence more keenly than their presence, as if silence itself had become a threat. One morning, the sheriff rode hard to the ranch, frost crusting his beard, his eyes grim. He told them Carver had broken jail, killing a deputy in his escape. His trail led north, but men like him never ran without settling debts first. The warning hung heavy in the cold air. Jake's jaw set firm, his voice calm but iron. "We'll keep watch. Whatever comes, we'll be ready." That night, Margaret sat with Jake on the porch, the two of them wrapped in blankets against the icy wind. Samuel slept soundly inside, his dreams safe for the moment. The stars burned clear above, sharp as diamonds scattered across the sky. Margaret leaned into Jake's warmth, the rhythm of his breathing steadying her heart. He told her then, his voice low, about the woman in Dodge City, the saloon girl barely 17, terrified of Carver's cruelty. Jake had stood between them, had killed a man to save her, and Carver had never forgiven him. Margaret listened in silence, her hand finding his, their fingers threading together. She felt the pain in his words, the weight of choices that had carved him into the man beside her. But she felt something else too, a deep, unshakable respect. He had carried his burdens with quiet honor, never boasting, never excusing, and now he carried hers as if they were his own. "Maybe we should postpone," she whispered, thinking of the whispers that would rise again, the danger that shadowed every horizon. Jake turned to her, his pale eyes fierce beneath the starlight. "No. We've put our lives on hold for men like Carver long enough. Tomorrow, we marry. Whatever storm he brings, we'll face it together." Morning came in a blaze of gold and rose, the sky painted with a beauty so defiant it felt like a blessing. Margaret dressed in her mother's gown, ivory silk yellowed slightly with time, its tiny pearl buttons glinting softly in the light. Mary Patterson helped fasten it, her hands gentle, her smile brimming with pride. Samuel tugged at the hem, his eyes wide with wonder. "Mama, you look pretty." Jake waited in the yard, clean-shaven, his suit plain, but made noble by the way he carried himself. When his gaze lifted to her, warmth spread through her body, like fire kindled against the winter cold. His eyes held no hesitation, only promise. The ceremony was simple, performed beneath a bower of bare branches tied with early spring greenery. Henrik Johansson gave her away, his weathered face softened with emotion. Neighbors gathered quietly, those who had stood with her through whispers and storms. Pastor Williams spoke the words, his voice trembling, perhaps from guilt, perhaps from grace. Margaret heard little of it. Her world had narrowed to Jake's hands, trembling slightly as they held hers, to his voice steady as he spoke his vows. "I take you, Margaret Sullivan, to be my wife, to stand with you in drought and in plenty, in storms and in sunshine, until death itself lays claim to us." Her own vow followed, clear and certain, her voice carrying over the snow-dusted yard. "And I take you, Jake Ryland, to stand beside me, to build a life worthy of the sacrifices made, to love you with all that I am, for all that I have left." When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Jake's kiss was tender, reverent, filled with healing and hunger in equal measure. Samuel cheered, small hands clapping, and Jake scooped him into their embrace, so the three of them stood together, a family forged not by chance, but by choice, by pain, and by love that refused to yield. The celebration was humble but joyful. Tables bowed under fried chicken, bread and pies neighbors had brought. Food enough to remind them all of community, of resilience. Music spilled into the air, and Jake led her into a dance, his hands firm at her waist, his smile soft. "Mrs. Ryland," he murmured, and the sound of it melted through her like sunlight through frost. Yet even in joy, shadows lingered. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in oranges and violets, Margaret caught sight of a lone rider at the edge of their land. Dalton. He sat astride his horse, watching with eyes that gleamed with cold promise, before turning and riding away. It was no surrender, only retreat. She knew he would come again, as surely as Carver would. But she felt no fear, not any more. The man beside her, the boy who laughed between them, the land beneath their feet, all of it bound together into something greater than threats. Love had become her shield, her anchor, her healing. That night, when the house lay quiet and the wind whispered against the walls, Margaret and Jake stood together on the porch, watching lightning dance faintly across the far horizon. "Storm coming," Jake murmured. Margaret leaned into him, her head against his chest, her arms circling his waist. "Let it come," she whispered. "We've weathered worse." And with his kiss soft upon her hair, she knew that no matter what the prairie hurled against them, they had already won the greatest battle, finding each other in a world determined to take everything away. The storm could rage, Dalton could scheme, Carver could threaten, but they would stand together. And beyond the night, beyond the fear, a new chapter waited, where love would not only endure, but grow fierce enough to defend everything they held dear. Snow lay heavy across the ranch, muffling the world in silence. The air was sharp with the scent of pine smoke, every breath cutting like glass. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, but the warmth of family filled the space more deeply than flames ever could. Margaret sat at the table, her sewing basket open, while Samuel played at her feet with the wooden horse Jake had mended months ago. The boys' laughter filled the room like a song, and every note was a reminder of healing, fragile, precious, alive. Jake came in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots, his shoulders broad beneath his worn coat. He set his rifle by the door, a habit that had become second nature since Carver's escape, and brushed frost from his hair. Margaret looked up at him, her heart tightening with the same unspoken awe she felt each time. He was no longer just the drifter who had arrived half dead at her gate. He was her husband now, her partner, the man who filled the silence of her nights with warmth. Cold's biting harder, he said, voice low as he hung his coat. Wolves'll be restless. We'll keep watch, Margaret answered. Their eyes met, a silent agreement woven through with trust. She poured him coffee, her fingers brushing his as she handed it over. The touch lingered, sparking through her like a pulse. That night, the howls came. A chorus rising from the ridge, wild and hungry. The horses stamped nervously in their pen, and Samuel stirred in his bed, murmuring. Jake rose, rifle in hand, and Margaret followed with her own, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. They stepped into the frozen night together, the snow crunching underfoot, breath pluming like smoke. The wolves circled, eyes gleaming in the moonlight, shadows slipping across the snow. Jake fired once, the crack echoing into the stillness, dropping one of the predators where it leapt. Margaret's hands shook, but her aim held true, her shot driving another back into the dark. Then the largest came, swift and silent, teeth bared, rushing for Bess. Without thought, Margaret lunged, swinging her rifle like a club, throwing herself between the wolf and the mare. The beast's weight knocked her down, hot breath flooding her face as its jaws snapped inches from her skin. A gunshot split the night. The wolf crumpled, lifeless, and Jake hauled her to her feet, his hands frantic over her arms, her face searching. "Are you hurt?" His voice was raw, desperate. "I'm fine," she gasped, chest heaving. Her shawl was torn, her cheek scraped, but she was alive. "You're insane," he growled, pulling her against him, his arms fierce. "Throwing yourself at a wolf." "Bess is all I have left of the old life," she whispered. "I couldn't lose her too." Jake pressed his forehead to hers, his breath ragged. "Don't you understand? You're all I have left of mine." The words slipped out unguarded, carrying more truth than he had ever dared to voice. Margaret's heart surged, her hands clutching his coat, grounding them both in the storm of fear and relief. Together they dragged the carcasses away, their breaths harsh in the frozen air. The night settled again, quiet save for the trembling of horses and the beating of their hearts. Side by side they stood beneath the moon, their rifles lowered, their shoulders touching. And Margaret knew then, with a clarity deeper than bone, they had already chosen each other. Every act of defense, every touch, every word was a vow. 3 days remained until the bank payment. The pouch of coins sat heavy in her chest drawer, not yet enough. Neighbors had come with what they could. Henrik Johansson with a handful of dollars, Mary Patterson with jars of preserves traded for feed. Each gift was more than money. It was a thread binding them to the community, a reminder that kindness was its own currency. Still, the sum fell short. On the 4th morning, Jake rose before dawn, his face grim as he saddled his horse. Margaret came to the door, Samuel still drowsing in his bed. "Where are you going?" she asked, though dread already filled her. "Dixon's ranch is hiring for a drive," Jake said quietly. 2 weeks' work. The pay might make the difference." "Jake, no." Her voice broke, raw with fear. "Not after what happened. Not after what we've shared." He cupped her face, his calloused thumb brushing her cheek. "I'm not leaving because I want to. I'm leaving because I have to. This land means everything to you, to Samuel. I'll come back." His pale eyes held hers, fierce and steady. "You're not losing me. Not now. Not ever." She tried to hold him there, to keep him from the dangers that had already stolen too much from them both. But the determination in him was unshakable. She let him go with trembling hands, watching as he rode into the dawn, his figure shrinking against the endless horizon. It felt like her heart had gone with him, leaving her chest hollow, aching. The days dragged heavy without him. Margaret threw herself into work, her hands blistering from the endless chores, her body weary but unyielding. She sold her last good dress, her mother's silver comb, clinging to the dignity of survival. Samuel grew quieter, asking each evening when Jake would return, his small voice carrying a weight too great for a child. Then, in the dead of night, smoke woke her. Flames roared against the barn, fire devouring the timbers, the shriek of horses piercing the air. She thrust Samuel onto the porch and ran, blanket over her head, the heat lashing her skin. Inside, animals screamed in terror. She fumbled at latches, driving Bess and the gelding toward freedom. But the blaze grew wild, choking her lungs. A beam cracked above, sparks cascading, and she stumbled, visions swimming. Strong arms seized her, hauling her from the inferno. "Margaret!" Jake's voice, rough with fear and smoke, wrapped around her like salvation. He had come back, ash streaking his face, his body trembling with the effort of saving her. He dragged her clear, coughing, his hands shaking as they checked her for burns. "What the hell were you thinking?" "The horses," she choked out, tears cutting clean lines through soot. "To hell with the horses," he said fiercely, crushing her against his chest. His voice cracked, breaking open the armor he wore. "If I'd lost you—" She clung to him, sobbing into his shirt, the fire's roar fading into the sound of his heartbeat, thundering in her ear. Around them, the barn collapsed in sparks and smoke, the sky above lit like judgment. But within his arms she felt only the fierce truth. She was alive because he had returned. By dawn, the barn was nothing but blackened ruin. The herd was scattered, half lost, the ground scarred. Margaret stood staring at the ashes, her son pressed close, Jake's arm firm around her shoulders. Her despair threatened to swallow her whole, but his voice broke through, steady, grounding. "We'll rebuild. We'll find what's left. We're not finished." She turned to him, eyes brimming with tears. "Maybe Dalton was right. Maybe I'm a fool to keep fighting." Jake caught her face in his hands, his gaze fierce. "Don't you dare! You're not beaten, Margaret. You've stood against men who wanted to break you. You've stood against fire, drought, and fear itself. You're the strongest soul I've ever known. And you're not alone anymore. I'm here. Always." Samuel tugged at Jake's sleeve, his voice solemn. "Don't go away again. We need you." Jake's eyes never left hers as he answered softly, "I'm not going anywhere, son." His words wrapped around her like a healing bandage, mending something broken inside. Despite the ruin, despite the impossible weight of loss, Margaret felt a spark of hope stir in her chest. She leaned into Jake's touch, her hand slipping into his, their fingers locking with quiet certainty. "Then we fight," she whispered. "We fight," he echoed, his lips pressing against hers, fierce and tender at once. And in that kiss, amid ashes and despair, was the beginning of something unbreakable, a love forged not in comfort, but in fire, tested by storms, sharpened by survival. Together, they turned toward the smoldering horizon, ready to face what waited, knowing that as long as their hands remained intertwined, no force of man or nature could truly undo them. The storm of the future gathered dark beyond the ridge. But Margaret's heart beat steady. Love had already made them invincible. The fight was far from over, but they would endure. Together. Spring came as if heaven itself had breathed over the land, melting away the long cruelty of winter. The prairie that had been grey and lifeless only weeks before was now alive with wild flowers, blue lupines and buttercups painting the fields, while Clear Creek sang with the rush of fresh snowmelt. Margaret stood on the porch of the rebuilt barn, her hand resting on the smooth timber, breathing in the scent of cut wood and wet earth. Around her, life pulsed again. The cattle grazed, stronger now, the horses tossed their heads with renewed spirit, and Samuel's laughter carried across the yard like bells. Jake was working with the young colt, his movements calm, his voice low and soothing. Samuel mimicked him, clumsy but eager, and Margaret's heart swelled at the sight. She had once feared her son would grow up with shadows where a father's presence should have been. But now she watched him learn patience, gentleness, and courage from the man who had become more than she had ever dared pray for. Jake caught her gaze across the corral, his smile rare and full, and something inside her softened further, healed deeper. Their wedding had been simple, yet truer than any dream. Pastor Williams, once harsh in judgment, had stood with trembling hands and clear eyes to bless their vows. Henrik Johansson had given her away with pride. Neighbors had brought food, music, laughter. Margaret still remembered the way Jake's hand had trembled when he placed the ring on her finger, his voice low as he promised to stand with her in drought and in plenty, in storms and in sunlight. And she remembered her own vow, her voice unwavering as she swore to love him with all she was. The memory glowed inside her, steady as an ember that would never die. Yet happiness did not mean peace. George Dalton still lingered, circling like a hawk denied its prey. His offers grew bolder, his threats sharper, but he never managed to strike true. Perhaps it was because the town had begun to shift. Where once they whispered about scandal, now they whispered about her strength, about how the widow had stood against the richest man in the county and refused to yield. Even the pastor, who had once looked at her with disapproval, had stood in court and spoken truth. In time, gossip bent under the weight of respect. Carver, too, once her greatest fear, had fallen. News came of his capture after a bank robbery gone wrong in Colorado, his trial swift, his fate sealed. The shadow he had cast over her life dissolved like smoke in the wind. Margaret felt no triumph, only a quiet release, as though a chain she hadn't realized she carried had slipped free. The ranch began to prosper under her and Jake's shared care. Cattle grew fat again, the horses multiplied, the corral stood strong, the chicken coop rebuilt larger than before. Work was constant, but it was no longer a burden born in loneliness. Every nail hammered, every row tilled, every fence mended was an act of building together. Margaret found joy in the smallest things. Jake's hand brushing hers as they carried water, Samuel's giggles as he learned to ride, the rare moments of rest when the three of them sat on the porch at dusk, watching the prairie glow under the setting sun. Yet what healed her most was the tenderness that threaded itself through their days. Jake was not a man of many words, but when he looked at her, she felt seen as she had never been before, not as a widow, not as a rancher, not as a woman weighed down by gossip and grief, but simply as herself, whole and unhidden. At night, when Samuel was asleep and the world lay hushed around them, Jake's touch was reverent, his voice low as he whispered her name. He held her as though she were both fragile and fierce, and in his arms she discovered a love forged not in ease, but in endurance, the kind that grows roots deep enough to weather any drought. Seasons turned, and with each one came proof that love had become the strongest foundation of all. Samuel grew taller, his laughter brighter, his questions endless. The ranch thrived, scars and all, the land blooming under their care. And though Dalton remained, watching from a distance with eyes still hungry, Margaret no longer felt fear. She had fought storms, fire, wolves, and the weight of men's disdain. She had faced death and loss and despair, and through it all she had found not just survival, but joy. Joy that softened her grief, joy that healed her heart, joy that gave her back to herself. On the evening of their first anniversary, they sat together on the porch, Samuel curled between them, the prairie awash in gold as the sun sank low. Jake drew her close, his lips brushing her hair, and whispered the words that once had seemed wild, but now felt like truth itself. "I'd still trade 10 herds for one night with you." Margaret laughed softly, her hand finding his, their fingers lacing together. "Good thing you don't have to. You've got me for every night. Forever." And as the first stars pierced the sky, she knew with a certainty that no drought, no fire, no man's greed could undo them. What they had built was stronger than the land itself. Love forged in loss, healed by tenderness, tempered by resilience. The widow and the drifter, once broken, had become whole together, their lives stitched into something enduring, something luminous. So if you find yourself touched by their journey, let your heart linger here a while. Share your thoughts, leave a comment, let their story breathe a little further through your words. And if it brought you comfort or sparked hope in your own quiet battles, let that healing ripple outward. Like, subscribe, and stay with us as more tales unfold beneath the endless sky. For love, like this land, is meant to be tended, shared, and carried forward into tomorrow.